Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from now. This story took place in the mountains of Tennessee in the early 20th century, when the world still harbored secrets that should never have come to light. What you're about to discover is one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Sevier County archives, a tale that blends obsession, religious fanaticism, and a marriage that should never have happened. It's the fall of 1911, and a ceremony is about to forever shake the small community of Gatlinburg. At that time, Tennessee was a state marked by isolated communities nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Gatlinburg was little more than a handful of wooden houses scattered among deep valleys and dense forests. Families lived far apart, separated by steep trails and turbulent rivers. Religion was the center of social life, and each community had its own interpretations of Scripture, often distorted by isolation and a lack of formal education. It was in this setting of extreme religious fervor that Margaret and Thomas Whitmore were born, identical twins who entered the world on a stormy night in March of 1883. The Whitmore family was known locally for its unique beliefs. The patriarch, Josiah Whitmore, was an itinerant preacher who traveled the surrounding counties with apocalyptic sermons. He believed he had received divine revelations during his mountain retreats, visions that spoke of the end times and the need for spiritual preparation. Among these revelations was a specific prophecy about his twin sons, a prediction he recorded in a leather notebook he kept as a sacred relic. According to his notes, Margaret and Thomas were not ordinary twins, but two halves of a single divided soul, destined to reunite in a sacred bond when they turned 18. Throughout the twins' childhood and youth, Josiah obsessively repeated this prophecy. He increasingly isolated the family, building a property far from the city, surrounded by miles of forest. Margaret and Thomas grew up with virtually no contact with others, educated only by their father's distorted teachings. They shared everything, from their bedroom to their clothes, and Josiah encouraged this excessive closeness, claiming it was part of God's plan. Their mother, Rebecca Whitmore, tried to intervene a few times but was silenced by her overbearing husband, who controlled every aspect of family life. When the twins turned 18 in March 1911, Josiah announced that the time had come to fulfill the prophecy. Margaret was engaged to Thomas in a private ceremony, held only in the presence of immediate family. The news slowly leaked through Gatlinburg, causing horror and disbelief. Close neighbors who occasionally crossed paths with the Whitmores on trips to town began to question whether it was real or just an exaggerated rumor. But Sevier County records tell the truth. In September 1911, a marriage license application was filed with the local clerk's office, clearly identifying Margaret and Thomas as twins and requesting permission for the marriage. The clerk, a man named Henry Dalton, was shocked upon reading the document. He immediately refused the license, explaining that such a union was not only immoral, but also illegal under Tennessee law. Josiah Whitmore, however, refused to accept the refusal. He argued that his divine revelations trumped earthly laws and that the marriage would proceed anyway, with or without official approval. Henry Dalton recorded the entire conversation in a report he sent to the county sheriff, warning of the troubling situation developing in the mountains. Sheriff William McCready, accompanied by two deputies, decided to visit the Whitmore estate. They rode for over 3 hours over difficult trails until they found the isolated house. Josiah greeted them hostilely, gun drawn, asserting that no earthly authority had jurisdiction over spiritual matters. Margaret and Thomas were present, but remained silent, their blank stares fixed on the ground. The sheriff tried to speak to them separately, but they both repeated the same memorized phrases about destiny and divine union. It was clear they had been deeply indoctrinated. With no evidence of imminent foul play, the sheriff could do nothing but warn Josiah of the legal consequences if he went ahead with the marriage. He returned to Gatlinburg frustrated, but kept a close eye on the situation. Townspeople began to speak openly about the case, divided between those who wanted more aggressive intervention and others who believed the authorities should not interfere in family and religious matters. The local newspaper, the Gatlinburg Gazette, published a discreet article about the marriage controversies, naming no names, but everyone knew who it was. Meanwhile, in the mountains, wedding preparations continued. Josiah invited an itinerant preacher from his travels, a man named Ezekiel Brand, known for accepting heterodox interpretations of Scripture in exchange for payment. Ezekiel arrived at the Whitmore estate in mid-September, bringing with him an old Bible and a willingness to perform ceremonies that other religious people would refuse. He spent 3 days at the house, conducting rituals of purification and spiritual preparation that no one outside the family witnessed. The ceremony was scheduled for September 28, 1911, under the light of a full moon that would illuminate the valleys of Tennessee. Josiah chose that date because he believed the position of the stars would favor the sacred union, according to his personal interpretations of ancient texts that he himself translated in his own unique way. The property was prepared with candles and religious symbols that blended Christianity with the mystical beliefs the patriarch had developed over the years. Rebecca Whitmore, the twins' mother, remained in deathly silence, her face etched with a profound sadness she dared not express in words. On the morning of that fateful day, a young lumberjack named Samuel Curtis was working in a field near the Whitmore estate when he heard strange chanting echoing through the forest. Curious and concerned, he approached close enough to observe what was happening from afar. Samuel saw Margaret dressed in a simple white gown, standing next to Thomas, both holding hands before the preacher Ezekiel Brand. The scene was disturbing not only for its depiction, but also for the somber atmosphere that enveloped it. Samuel later recorded in his testimony that something was profoundly wrong at that moment, a feeling of witnessing something that violated the very laws of nature. The young lumberjack raced to Gatlinburg to alert the authorities, but he arrived too late. By the time Sheriff William McCready and his deputies reached the Whitmore estate, it was already nightfall, and the ceremony had concluded. Josiah greeted the officers with a triumphant smile, presenting a handwritten document he called a marriage certificate signed by Ezekiel Brand. The sheriff immediately arrested both Josiah and the traveling preacher, charging them with conspiracy to violate Tennessee marriage laws. Margaret and Thomas were separated and taken into protective custody back to the city. The following days were chaotic in Gatlinburg. The case quickly gained notoriety, spreading to neighboring counties through telegrams and conversations in markets and churches. The Gatlinburg Gazette published a lengthy article, carefully reporting the events, but making clear the disturbing nature of the situation. Newspapers in Knoxville and Nashville sent reporters to cover what they called the darkest scandal in the Tennessee mountains. The community was divided, shocked, and at the same time fascinated by the case that defied all social and moral conventions of the time. Margaret was housed in the home of the sheriff's wife, while Thomas stayed in a boarding house supervised by respected members of the community. For the first time in their lives, the twins were completely separated. Several residents tried to talk to them, trying to understand what they really thought about this forced union. Their answers were always confusing and contradictory. Margaret spoke of destiny and divine purpose, repeating phrases she had clearly memorized from her father. Thomas showed signs of increasing mental confusion, alternating between defending the prophecy and displaying moments of disturbing lucidity where he seemed to realize the abnormality of the situation. A local physician, Dr. Jonathan Perkins, was summoned to assess the twins' mental state. He spent several hours speaking with each one separately, taking detailed notes that would later be presented to the court. His conclusions were alarming. According to Dr. Perkins, both Margaret and Thomas displayed signs of severe psychological manipulation, the result of years of isolation and indoctrination. They had been molded from a young age to accept their union as inevitable and sacred, deprived of any alternative perspective on life or normal relationships. Meanwhile, Josiah Whitmore remained in the county jail, unwavering in his convictions. He refused lawyers, saying he recognized no earthly authority over spiritual matters. During interrogation, he revealed more details about his beliefs, explaining that the prophecy had not been invented by him, but rather transmitted through visions he had received during prolonged fasts in mountain caves. Josiah genuinely believed that his twin sons were special beings, chosen for some grand purpose he could never quite explain. His words were a disconcerting mix of religious fervor and delirium. Ezekiel Brand, the preacher who performed the ceremony, took a different stance. He immediately hired a lawyer and claimed Josiah had deceived him about the bride and groom's true nature. Brand claimed he was told Margaret and Thomas were only distant cousins, not twins, and that he therefore performed the ceremony in good faith. The conflicting records and lack of official documentation made it difficult to prove or disprove his version. His case was separated from Josiah's, and after a few weeks of investigation, Brand was released with a stern warning and a warning to leave Tennessee immediately. Josiah Whitmore's trial began in November 1911 at the Sevier County Courthouse. It was one of the most anticipated events in the region's recent history, attracting dozens of curious spectators who packed the courtroom. District Attorney Charles Brennan presented a solid case based on testimony, court documents, and neighbors' testimony confirming the family relationship between Margaret and Thomas. Josiah's defense, even without a formal attorney, consisted of religious and philosophical arguments about freedom of belief and family autonomy, arguments that found no support in state law. During the trial, Rebecca Whitmore was called to the stand. She took the witness stand with shaky steps, visibly distressed by the situation. Her testimony was one of the most impactful moments of the trial. Rebecca revealed that she had tried repeatedly to confront her husband about the prophecy, but was always intimidated and threatened. She admitted to having failed to protect her children, and her silent tears moved everyone present. Rebecca described years of absolute control by Josiah, a man who turned faith into a tool of manipulation and isolated the family from the outside world to maintain his hold on their minds. Rebecca's testimony revealed an even darker dimension to the case. She revealed that Josiah kept a detailed diary recording every step of the twins' preparation for the fulfillment of the prophecy. This diary, which was later seized by authorities, contained hundreds of pages written over 18 years, documenting how he deliberately limited his children's contact with other people, controlled their reading and conversations, and incessantly repeated the idea that they were destined for each other. The entries revealed meticulous and disturbing planning, showing how Josiah constructed an alternate reality for his children, a mental prison from which they could not escape. The jury, composed of 12 local men, was visibly disturbed by the revelations. Prosecutor Charles Brennan argued that Josiah had committed not only a crime against Tennessee law, but also against human nature and dignity itself. He sought the maximum sentence permitted by the law at the time. The sentencing came in December 1911. Josiah Whitmore was sentenced to 10 years in prison for conspiracy to violate marriage laws and coercion. The sentence was met with approval by most in attendance, although some more radical members of certain isolated religious communities considered it a persecution of freedom of worship. But Josiah's conviction was only the beginning of an even more complex and disturbing story. Margaret and Thomas needed help rebuilding their lives and understanding that their union should never have happened. The Gatlinburg community rallied to try to help the twins, but no one knew exactly how to handle such an unusual situation. Dr. Jonathan Perkins suggested that they be permanently separated and placed in separate institutions where they could receive proper treatment and education, away from the influences of their past. Margaret was sent to live with a family in Knoxville, about 40 miles from Gatlinburg. The Henderson family, known for their work with people in difficult situations, agreed to take her in and help her through the transition. Thomas was placed on a farm in Blount County, where he would work as a helper in exchange for room and board, under the supervision of a farmer named Robert Mitchell, a trusted man recommended by Sheriff McCready. The separation was painful and confusing for both of them, who had never experienced independent living. The first few months were extremely difficult. Margaret suffered from severe anxiety attacks, waking up at night calling for her brother. She struggled to perform simple tasks alone, always expecting Thomas to be by her side, as he had been throughout her life. The Henderson family demonstrated extraordinary patience, gradually teaching her autonomy and individuality. They enrolled her in literacy classes at the local church, as her education had been extremely limited. Margaret slowly began interacting with other women in the community, although she always maintained a reserved and suspicious demeanor. Thomas faced similar challenges on his Blount County farm. He worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields, a routine that helped him channel his mental turmoil into physical activity. Robert Mitchell was a firm but compassionate man who established clear rules and healthy boundaries. He realized that Thomas was caught between two realities, the one his father had constructed and the one the real world presented. There were times when Thomas wondered aloud if he was betraying some higher purpose by living apart from Margaret, revealing the depth of the manipulation he had suffered. During this period of adjustment, Rebecca Whitmore was also trying to rebuild her own life. She left the mountain estate, which had been sold to pay the court costs, and moved into a small house in Gatlinburg. Rebecca found work as a seamstress, using her skills to support herself. She visited Margaret as often as possible, seeking to reconnect with her daughter and apologize for not having the courage to protect her earlier. These visits were fraught with silent emotion, as mother and daughter attempted to rebuild a relationship that had been warped by years of patriarchal control. But in April of 1922, something unexpected happened that would change the course of this story again. Thomas disappeared from the farm where he was living. Robert Mitchell woke one morning to find the young man missing from his room. His belongings were gone, and there were no signs of a struggle or violence. Thomas had simply departed during the night, leaving only a brief note stating that he needed to find his true path. The farmer immediately notified the authorities, and a search was launched in neighboring counties. News of Thomas's disappearance quickly reached Knoxville, causing Margaret to panic. She fell into a state of deep distress, refusing to eat or leave her room. The Henderson family tried to calm her, but Margaret obsessively repeated that Thomas was in danger, that he needed her, that the separation was unnatural. Dr. Perkins was called again and administered mild sedatives to Margaret to control the crisis. He warned authorities that the bond between the twins was stronger than they had imagined, the result of a lifetime of conditioning that could not simply be erased in a few months. For 2 weeks there was no word from Thomas. Posters were posted in towns across East Tennessee, describing the young man and asking for information. Sheriff McCready coordinated searches in rural areas, fearing that Thomas might have returned to the mountains where his family lived. But then, on a rainy May morning, Thomas was found in a situation no one expected. He was in a small abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Maryville, about 40 miles from where he had been living, sleeping on the wooden pews and surviving by petty theft from nearby farms. When authorities found him, Thomas was in a deplorable state, emaciated and feverishly eyed. He carried with him his father's leather notebook, the one where Josiah recorded the prophecy. Apparently, Thomas had managed to obtain the journal during a visit to the courthouse, stealing it from a file cabinet before fleeing. He spent those 2 weeks reading and rereading his father's words, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. During subsequent interrogation, Thomas revealed that he felt overwhelming guilt for having abandoned what he believed to be his destiny, but at the same time, he recognized that there was something deeply wrong with it all. Thomas was taken back to Sevier County, where he underwent a further medical evaluation. Dr. Perkins concluded that the young man was experiencing intense psychological conflict, torn between the mental programming of 18 years and the reality he was now trying to comprehend. The doctor recommended that Thomas be temporarily admitted to a sanitarium in Chattanooga, an institution that offered treatment for trauma-induced mental disorders. The decision was not easy, but it seemed the only viable alternative to help him process everything he had experienced. Upon learning that her brother had been found, Margaret insisted on seeing him before he was transferred to Chattanooga. Authorities debated at length whether to allow this meeting, fearing it might worsen their situation. Finally, under strict supervision, the twins were allowed to meet for 30 minutes at Sheriff McCready's office. The moment was described by witnesses as deeply moving and disturbing. Margaret and Thomas held each other in silence for several minutes, tears streaming down their faces, unable to articulate the conflicting emotions they were experiencing. During that brief conversation, overseen by Dr. Perkins and the sheriff, the twins recounted memories of their isolated life in the mountains. They recalled moments that would seem trivial to anyone else, but which carried immense weight for them. Margaret mentioned the cold mornings when they would wake before dawn for the prayer rituals imposed by their father. Thomas spoke of the afternoons they were sent into the forest on specific tasks, always together, never alone. There was a strange nostalgia in their voices, not for the situation itself, but for the only reality they knew, however distorted. Dr. Perkins gently intervened in the conversation, explaining to the twins that the connection they felt was not love in the sense their father had taught them, but rather a natural family bond that had been manipulated and transformed into something else. He used simple words, trying to penetrate the layers of conditioning that still dominated their minds. Margaret listened in silence, while Thomas showed signs of gradual understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally beginning to fit together in his consciousness. The meeting ended with a painful but necessary farewell. Thomas was transferred to the Chattanooga Sanatorium in June 1902. The institution was located in a wooded area on the outskirts of the city, a peaceful place where patients received treatment through structured routines, therapeutic work, and constant medical monitoring. The sanatorium director, a psychiatrist named Dr. Edwin Foster, who specialized in cases of psychological trauma, personally took charge of Thomas's treatment. He recognized immediately that he was dealing with an extremely rare situation, a case of family manipulation that went beyond anything he had previously treated. Thomas's first months at the sanatorium were marked by ups and downs. He participated in daily activities, worked in the institution's gardens, and attended group therapy sessions. But there were nights when he woke screaming, dreaming of his father's voice reciting passages from the prophecy. Dr. Foster implemented a gradual approach, allowing Thomas to express his beliefs without judgment, but carefully presenting alternative perspectives. It was a slow process of deconstructing an identity that had been artificially created. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her life in Knoxville with the Henderson family. She had made remarkable progress, learning to read and write more fluently, participating in local church activities, and even developing some friendships with women her own age. But the shadow of the past still haunted her. Margaret had recurring nightmares about the wedding ceremony, waking up confused about what was real and what was her father's plan. Mrs. Henderson, a woman of infinite patience, spent hours talking to her, helping her process the memories and understand that none of it had been her choice. In September 1902, exactly 1 year after the controversial ceremony, the Gatlinburg Gazette published a follow-up article on the case. The article, written with unusual sensitivity for the time, discussed not only the events that had shocked the community, but also raised broader questions about family control, religious manipulation, and the limits of parental authority. The article mentioned that both Margaret and Thomas were recovering, but avoided giving specific details to protect their privacy. The publication sparked discussions in other Tennessee communities about how to identify and prevent similar situations. Josiah Whitmore, serving his sentence in state prison, remained steadfast in his convictions. He refused visits from clergymen who tried to help him rethink his beliefs, insisting he had been persecuted for revealing spiritual truths that society was not ready to accept. Other prisoners avoided him, disturbed by his constant sermons and his inability to recognize the gravity of what he had done. Guards reported that Josiah spent hours writing in new notebooks, producing increasingly rambling texts about prophecies and heavenly destinies. It was clear he would never repent or change his perspective. Rebecca Whitmore, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to rebuild her relationship with her children. She visited Thomas at the sanitarium whenever her savings allowed the trip to Chattanooga, conversations filled with tears and pleas for forgiveness. Rebecca repeatedly explained that she had been a coward, that she should have protected her children even if it meant facing her husband's wrath. Thomas, gradually regaining his ability to process emotions healthily, began to forgive her, recognizing that she too had been a victim of Josiah's control. Rebecca's visits to Margaret in Knoxville followed a similar pattern. Mother and daughter would spend entire afternoons talking about what life would be like from now on, making modest plans for the future. Rebecca shared memories from before the twins were born, when she and Josiah were still a normal couple, before his religious obsessions consumed everything. Margaret listened with fascination and sadness, discovering that her family had not always been this dark prison in the mountains. There was hope that, with time and support, they could all find some form of peace. In early 1903, Dr. Edwin Foster submitted a detailed report to Sevier County authorities on Thomas's progress. The document, which would become a permanent part of the case file, described significant progress in the young man's recovery. Thomas had begun to actively question the beliefs his father had imposed on him, demonstrating a growing capacity for critical thinking. He participated in philosophical and religious discussions at the sanitarium, but now with a more balanced perspective, recognizing that Josiah's interpretations were dangerous distortions of legitimate spiritual teachings. The report also mentioned that Thomas expressed interest in learning a trade that would allow him to support himself independently upon leaving the institution. He had demonstrated a particular talent for carpentry, working in the sanatorium's workshop where patients made simple furniture. Dr. Foster believed that in approximately 6 months, Thomas would be ready to return to society, provided he continued receiving regular monitoring and remained in a structured environment away from negative influences. The news brought renewed hope to Rebecca and everyone involved in the case. Margaret, for her part, also showed remarkable progress. The Henderson family reported that she had become more confident and independent, taking on responsibilities around the house and even helping with Mrs. Henderson's small sewing business. Margaret learned the craft with dedication, revealing a natural ability for delicate handiwork. She began creating her own pieces, dresses, and embroidery that sold well among the women of Knoxville. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the pride of achieving something on her own merit, not by meeting expectations imposed by others. But despite the individual progress of both twins, one question remained unanswered and deeply concerned the professionals involved in the case. What would the future hold for Margaret and Thomas? Could they eventually have a healthy relationship as siblings, or had the manipulation they suffered permanently damaged their ability to interact normally? Dr. Perkins and Dr. Foster exchanged regular correspondence discussing this complex issue without reaching definitive conclusions. It was uncharted territory in human psychology, a case that challenged the medical knowledge of the time. In March of 1933, the twins turned 20. It was a significant date, marking 2 years since their lives had changed dramatically. Margaret spent her birthday in Knoxville, attending a small celebration organized by the Henderson family. She blew out candles on a simple cake, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. But throughout the party, her thoughts were with Thomas, wondering how he was spending his day. The connection between the twins remained strong, though now it was beginning to take on a healthier and more appropriate form. Thomas celebrated his birthday at the Chattanooga Sanatorium in a low-key gathering with other patients and members of the medical staff. Dr. Foster had allowed Rebecca to make a special visit that day, bringing modest gifts and a homemade pie. Mother and son spent hours talking about future plans, about the possibility of Thomas eventually working as a carpenter in some Tennessee town where he could start over without the burden of his past. Rebecca suggested that perhaps he could use a different name, start a completely new life, but Thomas refused. He said that running away from his history wouldn't solve anything, that he needed to learn to carry that burden with dignity. That same month, something unexpected happened that would bring a new dimension to the case. A Nashville newspaper published an extensive article about the Whitmore twins' story, written by an investigative reporter named Daniel Shaw. The article was detailed and surprisingly compassionate, focusing less on the sensationalist aspect and more on the psychological and social issues the case revealed. Shaw had interviewed several people involved, including Sheriff McCready, Dr. Perkins, and even some neighbors who knew the family before the complete isolation. The article generated widespread discussion throughout Tennessee. The publication had unforeseen consequences. Several families from different regions of the state contacted authorities reporting similar, though generally less extreme instances of excessive family control based on distorted religious beliefs. Daniel Shaw's article had sparked a public conversation about the limits of parental authority and the protection of vulnerable young people. District Attorney Charles Brennan used these reports to propose changes to state laws, seeking to create mechanisms that would allow for quicker intervention in cases of severe family manipulation. But the article also brought unwanted attention. Margaret and Thomas, who had previously managed to maintain a degree of privacy in their recovery, became known beyond the borders of their immediate communities. Curious onlookers began showing up in Knoxville, seeking a glimpse of Margaret, and the sanitarium in Chattanooga had to beef up security to protect Thomas from unauthorized visitors. The Henderson family worried about the impact of this exposure on the fragile progress Margaret had made. They briefly considered moving her to another city, but decided that stability was more important at that moment. In June of 1933, Dr. Foster determined that Thomas was ready to leave the sanatorium. He had completed his treatment with remarkable success, demonstrating a clear understanding of the mechanisms of manipulation he had suffered and developing mental tools to cope with disturbing memories. Thomas would be transferred to a halfway house in Knoxville, curiously in the same city where Margaret lived, although Dr. Foster was careful to choose a location far enough away to avoid accidental encounters. The geographic proximity was intentional, allowing the two to eventually rebuild a healthy fraternal relationship, but under careful supervision. The halfway house was run by a progressive religious organization that helped people reintegrate into society. The person in charge, a minister named Reverend Paul Thornton, had been carefully selected by Dr. Foster for his balanced and compassionate approach. Reverend Thornton firmly believed that genuine faith should liberate people, not imprison them, and he was committed to helping Thomas develop a healthy spirituality that could replace the distortions his father had instilled. It was a philosophy that stood in stark contrast to everything Thomas had known. During his first weeks in the transition house, Thomas worked at a local carpentry shop during the day and attended group therapy sessions at night. He met others who were also rebuilding their lives after traumatic experiences, and this camaraderie was essential to his ongoing healing process. Thomas discovered that he was not alone in his struggle, that many others had faced various forms of control and manipulation. These stories helped him contextualize his own experience and realize that recovery was possible, even when it seemed unlikely. Thomas's arrival in Knoxville created a delicate situation that required careful planning. Dr. Foster, in coordination with Dr. Perkins and Reverend Thornton, developed a specific protocol to manage the twins' proximity. They established that Margaret and Thomas should be informed of each other's presence in the city, but that any encounters should be carefully planned and supervised. The idea was to allow them to gradually rebuild a healthy sibling relationship, free from the distortions imposed by Josiah, but this could only happen when both were emotionally prepared. Margaret received the news of Thomas's arrival with a complex mix of emotions. On the one hand, she felt relief knowing he was well and had made progress in his treatment. On the other, she feared what this reunion might awaken in her, the memories and confusion that might still be dormant in her mind. Mrs. Henderson spent an entire afternoon talking with Margaret about the situation, helping her process these contradictory feelings. They discussed the difference between healthy familial love and the unnatural bond Josiah had tried to create, and how it was possible to care for a sibling without returning to the destructive patterns of the past. Weeks turned into months, and Thomas settled into a stable routine in Knoxville. He excelled at the carpentry shop where he worked, impressing the owner with his dedication and natural ability. His boss, a man named Augustus Miller, was known in the community for giving opportunities to people in difficult situations, and he immediately recognized Thomas's potential. Augustus taught him advanced woodworking techniques, allowing the young man to create increasingly elaborate pieces. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt he was building something of his own, an identity based on his own merits, rather than his father's delusional prophecies. During this period, Thomas began attending services at Reverend Thornton's church. Initially, he felt extremely uncomfortable in religious settings, automatically associating them with the manipulation he had suffered. But the Reverend's approach was completely different from anything Thomas had known. The sermons spoke of love, compassion, and individual freedom, never of control or predetermined destinies. Gradually, Thomas began to separate genuine spirituality from his father's distortions, discovering that it was possible to have faith without fear, a connection with the divine, without blind submission to authoritarian interpretations. Margaret had also found comfort in a religious community in Knoxville, albeit at a different church, farther from Thomas's hometown. She attended women's meetings where they discussed biblical passages and practical matters of daily life. These meetings were therapeutic for Margaret, offering her a safe space to explore her own spirituality without the trauma associated with Josiah's imposed rituals. The women in the group knew her story vaguely, but they treated her with dignity and respect, never asking invasive questions or showing judgment. It was a sanctuary where she could simply exist without the constant weight of the past. In October of 1933, Rebecca Whitmore made a momentous decision. She wrote separate letters to Margaret and Thomas, proposing that the three of them meet for a family meeting. Rebecca felt the time had come to begin rebuilding family ties in a healthy and honest way. She wanted to formally apologize to both of her children, not just in private conversations, but in a moment where everyone could be present and begin to collectively process the trauma they had experienced. The proposal was taken to Dr. Foster and Dr. Perkins, who discussed at length the risks and benefits of such a meeting. After careful consideration, the doctors agreed that the meeting could be beneficial, provided it took place in a controlled environment and with adequate supervision. It was decided that the meeting would take place in Dr. Perkins's office in Gatlinburg, a neutral location that was not associated with specific memories for any of those involved. The date was set for November 15th, a Saturday morning when everyone could comfortably travel into town. Dr. Perkins carefully arranged his office, arranging chairs in a circle to create an atmosphere of equality and dialogue, without hierarchies that might evoke previous family dynamics. The day of the meeting arrived with a chill typical of autumn in the Tennessee mountains. Margaret traveled from Knoxville, accompanied by Mrs. Henderson, who would wait in another room if her presence was needed. Thomas arrived with Reverend Thornton, visibly nervous but determined to face the moment. Rebecca was the first to arrive, an hour before the scheduled time, so anxious that she had been unable to sleep the night before. When the three met in the office waiting room, there was a moment of heavy silence, each processing the presence of the others after so much time apart. Dr. Perkins greeted them kindly and led them to his office. He explained that this would be a free session, where everyone could express whatever they felt necessary without judgment or interruptions. The doctor made it clear that his role there was solely that of facilitator, ensuring the conversation remained productive and respectful. He also established that anyone could request a break or end the session if they felt emotionally overwhelmed. With these guidelines established, Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice shaky but determined. She began by asking for forgiveness, not with the superficial words we sometimes use to soothe our own consciences, but with a deep and painful confession of her failings. Rebecca explained that she had long sensed that Josiah's beliefs were becoming dangerous, but that fear had paralyzed her. She spoke of the times she had tried to question her husband and been silenced with threats, of how she had gradually accepted the family's isolation as inevitable, of how she had watched helplessly as her children were molded to fulfill an absurd prophecy. Rebecca wept as she spoke, but continued until she had expressed everything she had held back for so long. Margaret was the next to speak, and her words surprised everyone with their maturity and clarity. She said that for a long time, she had blamed her mother for not having prevented what happened, but that now, after everything she had learned about manipulation and control, she could understand the impossible position Rebecca had been in. Margaret explained that she herself had been a victim, but she had also participated in the situation by passively accepting what was imposed on her. She acknowledged that forgiving her mother was part of her own healing process, of letting go of the anger that still held her captive to the past. Her words were those of someone who had grown far beyond what anyone expected. Thomas remained silent for a long time after Margaret finished speaking. He stared at the floor, internally processing everything that had been said. When he finally looked up and began speaking, his voice was firm but charged with suppressed emotion. Thomas said he felt immense guilt for having been the groom in that grotesque ceremony, even though he rationally knew he was also a victim. He explained that for months in the sanatorium, he had struggled with the feeling of having failed to protect Margaret, of having been complicit in something terrible. Thomas asked her for forgiveness, not for the choices they made while under their control, but for any time his presence or actions might have caused further suffering. What happened next was a moment of profound human connection that Dr. Perkins would later describe as one of the most meaningful of his career. Margaret slowly rose and walked toward Thomas. She reached out, gently taking his hands. Looking into her brother's eyes, Margaret told him there was nothing to forgive, that they had both been instruments in the hands of a troubled man, that the real Thomas and the real Margaret were just beginning to get to know each other. It was the first time they had touched since that supervised goodbye at the sheriff's office over a year earlier, and the meaning of that simple gesture transcended words. That meeting marked a pivotal turning point in the three's journey to recovery. Dr. Perkins closely observed their interactions, taking discreet notes on their body language and the communication patterns that emerged. He noticed that for the first time, Margaret and Thomas could be in the same room without exhibiting the conditioned behaviors Josiah had instilled. There was no longer the excessive, unnatural closeness, nor the coded language they had used under their father's control. They spoke as two separate people, with their own identities, who shared a traumatic past, but were no longer trapped by it. The session lasted nearly 3 hours, far beyond the originally planned time. The three discussed specific memories, confronting the distorted interpretations Josiah had imposed on ordinary events. Rebecca revealed details about how her husband manipulated everyday situations to reinforce prophecy, transforming banal coincidences into divine signs. Margaret and Thomas began to deconstruct these memories, realizing how they had been conditioned to see non-existent meaning in ordinary moments of life. It was a painful but liberating process, as if they were finally seeing reality without the distorting filter that had obscured their perceptions for so long. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Perkins suggested they establish a regular schedule of family meetings, perhaps once a month initially, always under supervision until everyone felt comfortable interacting independently. Rebecca agreed immediately, eager to rebuild her bond with her children. Margaret and Thomas were more cautious, but both acknowledged that the meeting had been positive and that they were willing to continue the process. It was decided that the next meeting would take place in December, allowing everyone time to process the intense emotions of that day. In the days following their meeting, both Margaret and Thomas reported significant changes in their feelings. Margaret told Mrs. Henderson that for the first time she could think of Thomas simply as her brother, without the confusing emotional baggage that had previously accompanied any thought of him. She described a feeling of lightness, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thomas shared similar feelings with Reverend Thornton, explaining that he could finally separate his natural love for a sister from the distorted expectations his father had created. The Whitmore twins case continued to generate interest beyond Knoxville and Gatlinburg. In December 1933, a Boston psychiatrist named Dr. Harrison Webb traveled to Tennessee specifically to study the case. He had read Daniel Shaw's article and was fascinated by the psychological implications of the situation. Dr. Webb requested permission to interview those involved and write a case study for publication in a medical journal. After careful deliberation, Dr. Perkins agreed, provided that Margaret and Thomas's identities be protected through the use of pseudonyms. Dr. Webb's interviews lasted several weeks. He spoke extensively with the twins, Rebecca, and the medical professionals involved, and even managed to briefly interview Josiah in prison. The meeting with Josiah was particularly revealing. The patriarch remained absolutely convinced of his beliefs, interpreting his imprisonment as religious persecution and necessary martyrdom. He spoke about the visions he claimed to have received in the mountains in vivid detail, describing mystical experiences that, to him, were completely real. Dr. Webb concluded that Josiah likely suffered from some form of delusional disorder, possibly exacerbated by prolonged isolation and extreme fasting. The resulting study, published in early 1944 in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, became a landmark in the emerging medical literature on family manipulation and psychological control. Dr. Webb used the pseudonyms Anna and Arthur Sterling to protect the twins, but doctors and psychologists across the country recognized the case's importance. The study detailed the mechanisms by which Josiah conditioned his children, the isolation techniques he employed, and the therapeutic methods he used to aid their recovery. It was a groundbreaking document that would pave the way for future research on family psychological trauma. While the case gained notoriety in academic circles, Margaret and Thomas continued their lives in Knoxville with increasing normalcy. Margaret had become a respected seamstress in the community, with regular customers who appreciated the quality of her work. She began saving money with the intention of eventually opening her own small business. The transformation from a young woman who could barely perform simple tasks on her own to an independent, entrepreneurial woman was remarkable. The Henderson family watched her progress with genuine pride, knowing they had played a crucial role in her recovery. Thomas also thrived in his new life. Augustus Miller, impressed by his skills, promoted him to head carpenter in the shop. Thomas now oversaw complex orders and even taught younger apprentices. He had developed a reputation as a meticulous and reliable craftsman, and his turbulent past remained known only to a select circle. Thomas began to participate more actively in the community, attending church socials and even making some genuine friends. It was a life he could never have imagined when he lived isolated in the mountains under Josiah's rule. Monthly family meetings continued throughout 1944, each strengthening the bond between Rebecca, Margaret, and Thomas. Over time, Dr. Perkins's supervision became less necessary, and eventually they began meeting independently. Rebecca rented a small but comfortable house in Gatlinburg, a midway point between Knoxville and her children's homes. She prepared simple meals, and the three of them spent afternoons talking about the present and the future, consciously avoiding delving too deeply into painful memories of the past. These were healing gatherings, where a broken family tried to piece itself back together. During one such encounter, in June 1944, Margaret revealed something she had kept secret for months. She was being courted by a young draper named Daniel Morrison, who frequented the shop where she sold some of her work. Daniel was a few years older than Margaret, a childless widower who had moved to Knoxville seeking a fresh start after losing his wife to typhoid fever. He knew nothing of Margaret's past beyond that she came from a struggling family, and he treated her with genuine respect and kindness. Margaret was terrified of developing romantic feelings, fearing she was still too damaged for a healthy relationship. The revelation sparked a long conversation. Rebecca and Thomas initially reacted with protective concern, but both recognized that Margaret had a right to explore the possibility of true, healthy love. Rebecca suggested that Margaret speak with Dr. Perkins before making any major decisions, just to ensure she was emotionally prepared. Thomas, in turn, offered to meet Daniel and assess his intentions, demonstrating an appropriate brotherly protective instinct that contrasted completely with the unnatural dynamic Josiah had tried to create. It was a clear sign that the twins had finally developed a normal sibling relationship. Margaret followed his advice and spoke to Dr. Perkins about Daniel Morrison. The doctor listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about how she felt in his presence, whether there was any confusion between her feelings and past memories, and whether she could clearly distinguish between genuine affection and the distorted patterns she had learned. After several sessions, Dr. Perkins concluded that Margaret was indeed developing healthy romantic feelings for the first time in her life. He encouraged her to move forward cautiously but without fear, reminding her that she had worked hard to get to this point and deserved the chance to experience true love. The relationship between Margaret and Daniel Morrison developed slowly over the following months, with a caution that reflected not only Margaret's reserved nature, but also the wisdom of someone who had learned the hard way about the consequences of misunderstood attachments. Daniel was a patient man, sensing something delicate in Margaret's story, though she had not yet revealed the full details. He courted her in the traditional manner of the time, with outings chaperoned by Mrs. Henderson, formal visits to the house where Margaret lived, and long conversations about dreams and aspirations that remained carefully focused on the future, never dwelling on the past. Mrs. Henderson watched the romance unfold with a mixture of joy and maternal concern. She knew that Margaret would eventually have to tell Daniel about her past, and she feared how he would react upon discovering the truth. It wasn't a simple story to explain, and there was always the risk that even a good-hearted man might turn away upon learning the disturbing details of what Margaret had experienced. Mrs. Henderson talked at length with her husband about when and how Margaret should reveal her story, concluding that it was something only the young woman could decide, but that it should happen before the relationship progressed much further. In September 1944, during one of their monthly family gatherings, Thomas shared his own news. He had been invited by Augustus Miller to become a junior partner in the carpentry business, an extraordinary opportunity that recognized not only his technical skills, but also the trust he had built. The partnership would require a financial investment that Thomas did not yet have, but Augustus was willing to structure an arrangement where Thomas would gradually pay his share with his own labor. It was a chance to finally have something truly his own, to establish permanent roots and build a stable future. Rebecca and Margaret celebrated the news with genuine enthusiasm, recognizing how much Thomas had accomplished. The twins' good news contrasted dramatically with their father's situation. Josiah Whitmore continued serving his sentence in state prison, but his mental health had deteriorated significantly. Guards reported that he would spend entire days in complete silence, followed by sudden outbursts of incomprehensible sermons to no one in particular. He had stopped eating properly, claiming that prolonged fasts brought him closer to divine revelations. The prison administration considered transferring him to a psychiatric ward, but the infrastructure for mental health treatment within the prison system was virtually non-existent at the time. Josiah remained where he was, gradually losing himself more and more in his own delusions. Rebecca received periodic updates on Josiah's condition, though she had never visited him in prison. The thought of seeing him again stirred a mixture of fear, anger, and reluctant compassion for the man she had once loved, before his obsessions consumed him completely. She shared these updates with Margaret and Thomas during their meetings, not because she thought they should care, but because she believed in the importance of transparency. The twins reacted with understandable emotional distance, recognizing Josiah as the source of their trauma, but unable to feel any meaningful connection to him as a father figure. In the fall of that year, Margaret finally made the decision to tell Daniel Morrison about her past. She carefully planned the moment, choosing a Sunday afternoon when they could walk through Knoxville's public gardens, an open, quiet place where she felt safe. Mrs. Henderson had offered to be there, but Margaret insisted she needed to do it alone. As they walked among the trees that were beginning to change color with the arrival of autumn, Margaret began her story, her voice trembling at first, but becoming firmer as she continued. She recounted everything, from the isolation in the mountains to the grotesque ceremony, from the months of confusion to her slow recovery. Daniel Morrison listened in silence, his face shifting through a range of expressions: shock, sadness, anger at what had been done to her, but never revulsion or judgment. When Margaret finished, perhaps expecting him to walk away, Daniel completely surprised her. He gently took her hands and told her that her story only made his admiration for her even greater, that the strength it took to survive it and become the extraordinary woman she now was revealed a character he could only aspire to. He thanked her for the trust in sharing something so painful and promised that nothing she had experienced would change his feelings for her. Margaret wept, not from sadness but from profound relief and the realization that she was finally being seen as a whole person, not defined solely by her trauma. That conversation significantly deepened Margaret and Daniel's relationship. In the weeks that followed, he demonstrated through consistent actions that his words had been genuine. Daniel never asked invasive questions about details Margaret didn't volunteer, never showed any discomfort or hesitation in public, and treated Rebecca and Thomas with the respect he would give to any family member of someone he loved. When he finally met Thomas at a carefully arranged dinner, the two men developed a cordial relationship based on mutual respect. Thomas evaluated Daniel with the critical eye of a protective brother, but quickly realized that he was genuinely good for Margaret. While Margaret explored the possibility of a future with Daniel, Thomas was also beginning to consider romantic love for the first time. There was a young teacher named Catherine Wells, who attended the same church as him, an intelligent, gentle-natured woman who taught children from working-class families. Catherine and Thomas had spoken a few times after services, brief but pleasant exchanges on a variety of topics. Thomas was attracted to her, but he carried his own insecurities about relationships, fearing that his past made him unsuitable for any respectable woman. Reverend Thornton, noticing Thomas's hesitation, encouraged him to be honest about his circumstances from the start, arguing that someone truly worthwhile would understand. With considerable nervousness, Thomas invited Catherine for a chaperonious outing, and during that afternoon he revealed his story. Just as Daniel had done with Margaret, Catherine listened with compassion and without judgment. She thanked him for his honesty and admitted that she had heard vague rumors about something in his past, but that she had chosen to know him for the man he demonstrated in the present. Catherine was the daughter of a doctor who worked with vulnerable populations, and she had grown up understanding that a person's life circumstances did not always reflect their character. She was willing to get to know Thomas better, to see where their relationship might lead them. Rebecca watched both her children's romantic development with complex emotions. On the one hand, there was immense joy in seeing that Margaret and Thomas were building normal lives, with possibilities for love and family that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. On the other, there was a lingering melancholy, the knowledge that she had lost so many years she could have spent getting to know her children as individuals, years stolen by her own cowardice in not confronting Josiah sooner. She shared these feelings with a religious counselor in Gatlinburg, a wise woman who helped her process her guilt without letting it consume her. The year 195 arrived, bringing significant changes. In February, Thomas formalized his partnership with Augustus Miller, officially becoming co-owner of the carpentry shop. The small signing ceremony was witnessed by Rebecca, Margaret, Reverend Thornton, and Catherine Wells, who was now officially Thomas's girlfriend. It was a moment of genuine celebration, marking how far the young man had come since those dark days in the Chattanooga sanitarium. Augustus delivered a brief speech about character and second chances, moving everyone present with his unwavering faith in Thomas's potential. In April of that same year, Daniel Morrison proposed to Margaret. He proposed in the traditional manner, first asking Rebecca for her blessing during a visit to Gatlinburg, and then proposing to Margaret at a special dinner he had organized with Mrs. Henderson's help. Margaret accepted with tears of joy, finally experiencing what it meant to freely choose a commitment based on true love and mutual respect. The engagement was announced quietly among close friends and family, and the wedding date was set for September, almost exactly 4 years after that grotesque ceremony that had so traumatically marked their lives. Margaret's wedding preparations brought their own emotional complexities. She struggled with memories of the previous ceremony, sometimes waking from nightmares where she confused the two events. Dr. Perkins, whom she continued to see occasionally, worked with her to create rituals of distinction, ways to ensure that her marriage to Daniel would be markedly different in every significant way. It would be a public church ceremony with many guests, officiated by a respected minister, followed by a joyful reception. Every detail was carefully planned, not only to celebrate Margaret and Daniel's love, but also to affirm their freedom and autonomy. Thomas, upon learning of his sister's engagement, immediately offered to help in any way possible. He proposed personally building the furniture for Margaret and Daniel's future home, a gift that demonstrated both his skills and his genuine brotherly love. Margaret accepted, thrilled, recognizing the profound meaning of the gesture. The two spent several afternoons discussing designs and preferences, moments of simple, healthy connection between siblings who had finally found their way back to a proper relationship. It was a tangible redemption, transforming years of manipulation into something beautiful and normal. As wedding preparations progressed, unexpected news arrived from the state prison. Josiah Whitmore had fallen seriously ill. The combination of self-imposed malnutrition, poor prison conditions, and his deteriorating mental state had resulted in severe pneumonia. Prison doctors informed him that he would likely not survive. The administration asked Rebecca if she would like to visit him in his final days, a decision she felt compelled to discuss with Margaret and Thomas before making. The news of Josiah's terminal illness came at a particularly delicate time, as Margaret was immersed in wedding preparations and Thomas was cementing his new life as a businessman and committed man. Rebecca gathered her children at her Gatlinburg home to discuss the situation, knowing the decision could not be taken lightly. It was early August of 1955, and the Tennessee summer heat made the air in the small room heavy and dense, perfectly suited to the gravity of the conversation they needed to have. Rebecca began by explaining that she didn't expect Margaret or Thomas to accompany her to prison if she decided to go, but that she felt the need to share her decision with them. She admitted to being deeply torn. On the one hand, Josiah had been her husband for many years, and part of her remembered the man he'd been before his obsessions consumed him completely. On the other hand, he had caused irreparable damage to her children, turning their lives into a nightmare from which they were still recovering. Rebecca wondered if she owed him some final compassion, or if visiting him would be a betrayal of the very children she had failed to protect when they needed it most. Margaret was the first to respond, and her words demonstrated the maturity she had gained through years of therapy and self-discovery. She told Rebecca to do what her heart told her, that neither Margaret nor Thomas had the right to judge any decision she made. Margaret explained that for her, there was no desire to see Josiah again, no intense hatred, no morbid curiosity, just a distant indifference toward someone she now saw as a deeply troubled man who should never have had children. She recognized that Rebecca had her own history with Josiah, prior to and separate from the trauma of the twins, and that this history deserved its own closure. Thomas remained silent for several minutes after Margaret finished speaking, staring out the window at the distant mountains that had once been his prison. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, carrying the weight of complex emotions he was still processing. Thomas said part of him felt he should visit Josiah, not for forgiveness or reconciliation, but perhaps to finally confront the man who had stolen his childhood and shaped his mind in such destructive ways. But he admitted to being afraid of what that encounter might awaken, of old patterns that might still lie dormant somewhere in his psyche, waiting for a trigger to resurface. Rebecca listened to both her sons with silent tears streaming down her face. She thanked them for their honesty and for their implicit permission to follow her conscience. After further discussion, Rebecca decided she would visit Josiah one last time, alone, not to offer forgiveness she wasn't sure she could genuinely give, but to witness the end of a chapter in his life that had dragged on for far too long. She would do this before Margaret's wedding, ensuring that the visit wouldn't taint the upcoming celebration. Thomas and Margaret supported her decision, though both expressed relief that they wouldn't have to make the journey. Rebecca traveled to the state prison in mid-August, accompanied by the reverend from her Gatlinburg church, a man who offered spiritual support without judgment. The prison was a dingy stone building, located in a secluded rural area, surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Rebecca felt a tightness in her chest as she was led through narrow hallways to the infirmary wing where Josiah was confined. The smell of disinfectant mixed with disease permeated the air, and the sounds of coughing and moaning from other sick prisoners created an atmosphere of palpable despair. Josiah was unrecognizable. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over his family now lay frail on a narrow bed, his body ravaged by pneumonia and self-inflicted malnutrition. His skin had a sickly pallor, his once penetrating eyes clouded and distant. When Rebecca approached, he recognized her, but her reaction was unexpected. Josiah showed no remorse or apology. Instead, in a hoarse, broken voice, he began to speak of visions he claimed to be having, of angels who came to visit him at night, of how his imprisonment and suffering were necessary trials before his final glorification. It was clear that he had remained trapped in his delusions until the very end. Rebecca listened for a few minutes, but then she did something she had never managed to do in all their years of marriage. She interrupted him. In a firm but controlled voice, Rebecca told Josiah that he had destroyed the family he should have protected, that his visions were the product of a sick mind and not divine revelation, that Margaret and Thomas had survived despite him, not because of him. She said she had come not to offer comfort or absolution, but to witness the end of his control, to see with her own eyes that he no longer had power over her or her children. These were words she should have spoken decades ago, but they still carried meaning, even at that late moment. Josiah tried to respond, but was overcome by a violent coughing fit that left him gasping and exhausted. A prison doctor present intervened, indicating that the visit should end. Rebecca nodded, preparing to leave, but then Josiah managed to utter a few final words. He said that Margaret and Thomas were special, that she would never understand the greater purpose he had seen for them, that one day the truth would be revealed. Even on the brink of death, he remained completely unable to acknowledge the reality of what he had done. Rebecca left the infirmary without looking back, knowing she had done what she had to do, but under no illusions that Josiah would ever understand the magnitude of his crimes. The drive back to Gatlinburg was silent. Rebecca internally processed what she had witnessed, the profound sadness of seeing a human being so completely consumed by his own illusions that not even the proximity of death could bring him back to reality. She felt pity for him, not the compassion that might lead to forgiveness, but the sadness we feel at a life completely wasted chasing destructive fantasies. When she arrived home, Rebecca wrote separate letters to Margaret and Thomas, describing the visit honestly but sparing them the most disturbing details. She concluded both letters by saying that they were finally free, that Josiah would soon be nothing more than a painful memory that would continue to lose power over them as time passed. Josiah Whitmore died 3 days after Rebecca's visit, on the evening of August 19, 1955. The news arrived via a formal telegram from the prison administration. There was no funeral, as Rebecca refused to claim the body or organize any ceremony. Josiah was buried in the prison cemetery, in a simple grave marked only by a number, alongside other prisoners who died without family to mourn them. It was a fittingly anonymous end for a man who had caused so much suffering in the name of imagined greatness. Margaret and Thomas received the news with that same distant indifference, acknowledging the event, but not allowing it to disturb the equilibrium they had achieved. With Josiah's death, it felt like a final chapter had closed, allowing everyone to move forward without that shadow still hanging over them. Preparations for Margaret's wedding continued with renewed energy. The ceremony was scheduled for September 23rd, and the Knoxville community, which had welcomed Margaret and witnessed her journey of recovery, was excited to celebrate with her. The church was decorated with autumn flowers, and Mrs. Henderson coordinated every detail with the care of someone preparing their own daughter's wedding. Daniel Morrison eagerly awaited the day he could finally call Margaret his wife, not only out of love, but also out of deep admiration for the extraordinary woman she had become. On the morning of the wedding, Margaret woke up in the Henderson home, surrounded by women who had become her true friends over the years. As they helped her dress and styled her hair, Margaret thought about everything that had changed since that terrible September morning 4 years earlier. She thought about the confused and manipulated young woman she had been, unable to distinguish reality from illusion, love from control. Now, looking in the mirror, she saw a woman who had achieved her own identity, who knew who she was and what she wanted, who consciously chose the love she was about to celebrate. It was a transformation that seemed nearly impossible, but there she was, living proof that recovery was possible, even from the deepest traumas. Thomas arrived at the church early, dressed in his best suit and carrying the appropriate nervousness of someone about to walk his sister down the aisle. He had been chosen by Margaret for this honor, and the significance was not lost on either of them. Years before, he had stood beside her in a grotesque ceremony that represented everything that was wrong in their lives. Now he would accompany her in a celebration that represented hope, healing, and the possibility of futures they had earned through hard work and courage. When Margaret descended the stairs of the Henderson home, and Thomas saw her in her wedding dress, he felt tears of emotion he didn't try to hide. The ceremony began in the golden light of a September afternoon, as guests filled the pews with a mixture of curiosity and genuine affection for Margaret. The reverend who would officiate the wedding, a gentleman named Pastor Edmund Price, had spent time getting to know the couple and understood the unique importance of their union. He had structured the ceremony to emphasize choice, freedom, and true love, words that resonated with special meaning for all who knew Margaret's story. As the music began and the church doors opened, everyone in attendance turned to witness this transformative moment. Margaret walked in on Thomas's arm, her steps measured and confident. She looked ahead to where Daniel was waiting for her with a radiant smile, surrounded by friends and the light streaming through the church's tinted windows. There was no fear in her eyes, no trace of the confusion that had once gripped her. Each step she took beside her brother was an affirmation of freedom, a silent declaration that she had regained control over her own life and destiny. Thomas felt the significance of each step too, knowing that they were finally redeeming the brotherly bond that Josiah had so cruelly tried to distort. When they reached the altar, Thomas gently placed Margaret's hand in Daniel's, a gesture of trust and blessing that brought tears to the eyes of many present. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Pastor Price spoke of love that liberates rather than imprisons, of commitments freely chosen rather than imposed, of the courage it takes to build something beautiful from ashes. Margaret and Daniel exchanged vows they had written themselves, words that promised partnership, respect, and mutual support. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife and kissed before the congregation, the applause was enthusiastic and heartfelt. Rebecca, seated in the front row, wept openly, not from sadness but from profound relief and gratitude for witnessing this moment she feared would never come. The reception was held in a community hall decorated with elegant simplicity. There was music, dancing, abundant food, and joyful conversation that continued well into the evening. Margaret circulated among the guests, her face lit with a genuine happiness that spread to everyone around her. She danced first with Daniel, then with Thomas, and finally with several other guests who wanted to share her joy. It was a celebration not just of a wedding, but of survival, recovery, and the triumph of the human spirit over circumstances that could easily have destroyed anyone. In a quiet moment at the party, Rebecca found a few minutes alone with Margaret. The two women embraced for a long time, needing no words to express their feelings. Rebecca finally said she was proud, not only of who Margaret had become, but of the strength she had always possessed, even when buried under layers of manipulation and control. Margaret replied that none of it would have been possible without all the people who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. The Henderson family, Dr. Perkins, Dr. Foster, and especially Rebecca, who had found her own courage, perhaps too late, but not too late to make a difference. It was a moment of profound reconciliation between mother and daughter. Thomas also had his private conversation with Margaret before she and Daniel left for a brief honeymoon in Chattanooga. Brother and sister stood side by side on the terrace of the hall, gazing at the mountains stretching into the distance in the twilight. Thomas told her he was happy for her, that Daniel was lucky to have found someone so extraordinary. Margaret replied that she was the lucky one, not only to have found Daniel, but to have a brother who had gone through the same hell she had and emerged on the other side as a good and upright man. They talked about the future, about Thomas's plans to eventually propose to Catherine, about the possibility of both of them having families of their own someday, definitively breaking the cycle of trauma Josiah had tried to perpetuate. The following months brought more positive changes. Margaret established her home with Daniel, a modest but welcoming home where she finally experienced what it meant to build a life based on her own choices. Daniel supported her in everything, including her decision to continue working as a seamstress, recognizing that independence was important to her. Thomas, encouraged by his sister's example, proposed to Catherine Wells in December 1905, and she happily accepted. Their wedding was set for the following spring, another celebration of new beginnings and redemptive possibilities. Rebecca continued her life in Gatlinburg, finding purpose in helping other women facing controlling families or abusive relationships. She worked quietly through the church, offering her home as a temporary refuge and sharing her own story as an example that it was never too late to make courageous choices. It was her way of turning her own mistakes into something meaningful, of creating some good from all the suffering her family had experienced. She visited Margaret and Thomas regularly, delighting in seeing her children thrive in ways that seemed impossible just a few years before. The Whitmore twins case gradually faded from public gossip to become part of Tennessee's medical and social history. Dr. Harrison Webb's study continued to be cited in psychological literature, helping other professionals identify and treat similar cases of family manipulation. District Attorney Charles Brennan successfully pushed through changes in state laws that allowed for faster intervention in situations of psychological abuse, using the Whitmore case as an example of what could happen when warning signs were ignored for too long. It was a small but significant legacy, bringing some good to a deeply dark situation. The years passed, bringing gradual healing and the building of lives that finally belonged to their protagonists. Margaret and Daniel had children, as did Thomas and Catherine. The children grew up knowing only simplified versions of their parents' story, appropriate for their ages, but always emphasizing themes of courage, recovery, and the importance of making one's own choices. Rebecca became a devoted grandmother, seeing in the next generation an opportunity to do things right from the start, to demonstrate unconditional love without control or manipulation. It was a personal redemption she deeply valued. The secluded mountain property where it all began lay abandoned for years after its forced sale. Eventually, it was acquired by a family unaware of its dark history, and they transformed it into a working farm. The walls that had witnessed years of manipulation and control now echoed with the laughter of new children, playing freely under the Tennessee sun. It was as if the land itself was healing, the weight of the past gradually dissipating under the weight of new beginnings and happier memories. Decades later, when Margaret was already an elderly woman, a local historian interviewed her for a project on notable cases in Tennessee in the early 20th century. Margaret agreed to participate, but only on the condition that her story be told sensitively, focusing not on the sensationalism of what happened, but on the lessons of human resilience, the importance of community support systems, and the dangers of allowing extreme ideologies to flourish unchallenged. She wanted young people, who might be going through similar situations, to know that escape was possible, that recovery was possible, that their lives didn't have to be defined by the worst moments they faced. The story of the Whitmore twins remains in the Sevier County archives, a grim reminder of how distorted faith and isolation can create conditions for profound psychological abuse, but also a testament to the power of community, emerging medical science, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Margaret and Thomas not only survived, they thrived, building lives filled with genuine love, healthy relationships, and meaningful purpose. They transformed what could have been simply a story of trauma into a narrative of hope and redemption. Together, we traveled through the dark mountains of Tennessee, witnessed the horrors of absolute family control, and followed the extraordinary journey of two souls who refused to remain prisoners of the past. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when manipulation seems to have completely won, there is still the possibility of freedom and rebuilding. If you were impacted by this disturbing but ultimately hopeful narrative, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more dark stories from the American past that reveal both the worst and the best of human nature. And in the comments, share your thoughts. How can we as a society identify and intervene in situations of family manipulation before they cause irreparable damage? Thank you for following this journey through the shadows of history to the end.